Vedic Astrology podcast is brought to you by a dedicated and intimate community of patrons. Perhaps you'd like to join us where we meet every week to check in and talk astrology, and where we have monthly gatherings to deep dive into our personal charts, to study Vedic astrology, and to apply and harness transits. Join us today, and thanks for listening to the Vedic Astrology podcast. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Vedic Astrology podcast. My name is Fiona Martin, and today I'm taking a dive into a topic that really interests me: the connection between our intimacy, our sexuality, and transitions, losses, trauma, and even death. I think astrology is one of the practices that puts intimacy and transformation and loss all into focus. So I was thrilled when I recently came across a research paper published in the International Journal of Sexual Health, and its title is Grief and Sexual Intimacy. So I reached out to the main researcher, whose name is Sarah Jones, and she's agreed to be on the podcast with me. Sarah, welcome.
Thank you so much. I love that you're so interested.
And Sarah is a holistic trauma therapist, and this research paper delves into the experience of therapists working almost exclusively with grief and how lives of the clients are affected during times of loss. Can you tell us a little bit about your research, Sarah?
Yeah. So I had the idea for a really long time. For some reason, it had been sitting under the surface for ages, and I was looking for a reason to explore the topic because I had this idea that there was some kind of interaction between the two subjects, and it was way more common than anyone was talking about. That there are depictions in film, you read about it in books, it's there in other kind of sources, but research-wise, nobody was really talking about it. And it's two very taboo subjects. For that reason, it was so interesting to explore that with therapists and to realize that even for them, a lot of them found it really hard to approach the topic. They had difficulties discussing it with their clients. Their clients found it hard to bring up the subject with them, even though it was really affecting their lives in different ways, because there are lots of ways that the sexual lives of bereaved clients could be affected, so many ways, but that they weren't feeling able to bring that to therapists, or certainly not very often. And when they were, the kind of conversations that were happening and where that was going. So it was a really fascinating subject to explore in what feels to me like a really important but really unloved topic.
I hear everything you're saying. In fact, I love that you mentioned two taboo topics, and maybe that's what links them in astrology. They often would be associated with the eighth house is often associated with intimacy and sexuality, with transformation. And the 12th house is often associated with loss and grieving and death. But both the 8th and the 12th can be associated with sex and with death. So we've got these two taboo topics mixed together. So tell us a little bit about your role. You're a holistic trauma therapist. It's obviously linked in some ways to your research. Tell us a little bit about being a holistic trauma therapist.
So the reason for the title is because I work with a number of modalities. I have a background both in psychology, psychotherapy, and also in embodiment work. So looking at treating the person as a whole person. And these kind of topics, they touch us in terms of sensation. Obviously, for this kind of subject, physical touch is important. So the idea is really that when we ignore the body and just work with the mind, we're missing so much important information, and vice versa. So for me, it's really important to work with people at their own pace, not to force or push in any way, but also to allow people to maybe explore these difficulties in ways that perhaps some more conventional methods of therapies don't always offer.
And if you need to get in touch with Sarah, her details are in the notes, but I might just get you, Sarah. How can people get in touch with you?
People can get in touch with me via my website, which is therapylumina.com. That's probably the easiest way. They can also find me on Instagram, and I also write on Substack, so they could find me there too. I think that level of embodiment or somatic work is gaining more and more recognition, particularly in the field of trauma, and the awareness that what we carry is not just the stories that we tell ourselves.
Meaning that would be a more mental or intellectual or thought-based, but we're holding information in our body or...
Absolutely. Yeah. And for a lot of reasons, it often doesn't feel safe to look at that information, especially if looking at people with perhaps histories of relational trauma and that kind of thing can be very hard to feel safe enough with anyone to be able to explore our sensation, our feeling. Sometimes it can be quite a dissociative process. So to connect back into what we feel is really important. And it's not to devalue the story, because sometimes the story is really important as well. It's just saying there's so much more.
I think this whole area is fascinating. So as an astrologer, this speaks to me about these moksha houses that we have in astrology, which is the 4th house, the 8th house, and the 12th house. And in Vedic astrology, in a way, we think of them as being wonderful. They're the houses of enlightenment, the houses that are leading us to that path of the freedom from delusion and a way to grow and learn. So they're exalted. Maybe for Vedic astrologers, we think of moksha as being very important, very beautiful. But everyone's experience of moksha houses is quite intense. They're really private and intimate houses. The 4th house rules our home, our inner sanctuary, our heart center, and our inner peace, where we know that we're safe no matter what crazy things are going on in the world. Hopefully everybody has a 4th house that they can rely on, retreat into, and recover in. It's our rejuvenation space inside the self. Incredibly intimate. And in terms of when we're born, the 4th house is what is underneath the earth at the time of the birth. So it's quite hidden as well. It's the part of the sky you can't see when you're born because it's underneath planet Earth. But then we have these 2 other moksha houses, the 8th house and the 12th house. And the 8th house is the deepest, darkest caves that we all need to explore. So often the 8th house is really associated with psychology and maybe the kind of role that you're talking about, that being a therapist, helping people navigate their own dark caves, that for so long as we can't navigate those caves, we're always afraid of ourselves, and that makes us afraid of others. So one of the things I love about the 8th house is if we do the 8th house well, or if we do Scorpio well, because it's the 8th sign, we come out of those places, Scorpio in the 8th house, a friend to all, because we've made friends with all of our inner demons. And so there's nothing to project out anymore. And therefore, that is why the 8th house also gets associated with intimacy, because it goes from the 7th house of the boyfriend or the girlfriend to the 9th house of the person we're married to. And the only way to get from boyfriend, girlfriend to life partner is to pass through this unknown, uncharted territory of intimacy where people drop all of their guards, and one has to navigate that with another person. And not all relationships can survive that. Some people's crazy is too much. Sometimes our own crazy is too much. And that's where sexuality can often be seen in that chart as well, because the nature of the 8th is asking us to drop all of the facade and all of that outward game that we're playing and be truly vulnerable. So obviously the 8th house is also associated with trauma. But then finally, this 12th house, the final moksha house, has these associations of transcending. And as many people follow Vedic astrology because of its spiritual path, we can see the 12th house as being where we're all aiming for and wanting to have that connection with the beyond. So these are great things about the 12th. But of course, the 12th can also be death and loss, and how we navigate those things, whether it's a loss of relationships or physical loss of people dying, or sometimes it's loss of money and belongings, loss of status. So many ways that we can be asked to release and let go. And all of that shows up in the 12th house. And each of these have their own dark sides, but the 12th house in some ways has that escaping element to it, which you were talking about, of dissociating, that it's the least embodied house. And sometimes the trauma that we experience in the 8th is too much for us. And the 12th becomes an outlet of escape, of avoiding, of dissociating, of disconnecting with our body, or even of escaping through substances. So that's why this really fascinates me, the link between the 8th and the 12th. How much trauma in the 8th house can we transcend through, and how much of it actually causes us to disconnect and disintegrate rather than integrate.
There's so much here. I feel like we could talk about this for hours. It's fascinating because my subject is not astrology. I want to be very honest that I really don't have knowledge of astrology, but I love the way that you're talking about this. And as a way to have a conversation, this is super interesting to me. And all of the themes, you just seem to resonate so much. And I think we have so much fear, particularly around the process of death and loss. And it's hard because of the 12th house, we're always in some kind of state of transformation. The world around us we're always in cycles. Always. There has to be a death for there to be a rebirth. There has to be a winter for there to be a spring. And the process that we go through, I very often talk to people about grief work as really it's kind of identity. It's so identity related. It's so much about how we see ourselves. A huge part of that is how we navigate these kind of transformations, these kind of personal, whether it is the death of somebody or the death of a part of us or the death of an identity or how we've seen our life or ourselves. Something comes to an end. And all of a sudden, we're trying to make sense of what our lives look like in the face of that. Definitely.
And we were talking about the astronomy of the 4th house is underneath the earth when you're born. The 12th house is that zodiac sign that was rising the one before you were born. So whatever ascendant was on the eastern horizon, that other sign had only just finished. So for the first day of your life, that 12th house is always moving through the horizon, just out of your reach. And it's almost as if we're born with our backs to that previous sign. And we spend the day getting the programming or whatever astrology does of we look through the first house that rises, and then the second house rises, and then the third house rises for the day, and the 4th house. And it's like we're looking in that direction, getting our life path, understanding what it is that we've come to this amazing field of earth to learn. But we can't really look behind our shoulder and see what it was that was there before we arrived. And that's why the 12th to the 1st can be what you're saying, this, how do I traverse a time of change in my ego identity? I thought I was this person's, whoever you've lost, this person's daughter or this person's husband or this person's child, whatever. And how do I find my new life path when this role has changed so significantly, which could be the loss of one's country, the loss of one's job. As you said, there's many ways to have one's identity being challenged to update.
It seems like a process of renegotiation, both with the self, but also inevitably with the closest people around us. So I think as well, you were mentioning intimacy, I think in relation to the 8th house. And there are so many different types of intimacy. There are intimacies that we have with different people. There are intimacies that we have with friends. There's intimacies that we have with parents. Then there's intimacy that we have with partners, lovers, all of that kind of thing. There's a different type of intimacy that we have within therapeutic relationships, for example. And obviously, sexual intimacy is just one small part of all that we explored in this particular piece of research, but also really being able to explore within intimacy of all kinds is so important. And within ourselves, within our intimate relationship with ourselves, which can be really confronting and really hard to look at. So it is both this internal process and this external process.
That makes sense.
Mm.
And then let's try and bring it into more tangible experience. So I think my strongest experience of loss in some ways was a loss of my mother, because I was lucky enough to be with her as she was transitioning. It was a very powerful experience for me, and it's strange to say I really enjoyed it, but I felt like I was in the right place at the right time. I learned a lot. And spiritually, I learned a lot, and it's all fit into my spiritual world. It didn't cause me to have to renegotiate my identity spiritually. So in that way, it was a very calm and peaceful experience. But in another way, I've just felt exhausted, or I felt that my energy was very low in the period after my mum passed. So in the 12th house, in astrology, we think about it as like the energy is just whooshing out. And this is how I personally felt like I was an energy bucket with lots of holes in it. Didn't matter how many wonderful things were happening in my life, which they were. All of that wonderful, joyous stuff, fantastic, was just also seeping out. There was no holding on to anything. And it was, for me personally, not really a time when I wanted to particularly experience sexual intimacy, because it's such an alive and embodied experience. To be with someone physically, intimately, is very embodied and fleshy and energizing. But interestingly, when I mentioned your paper to my husband about grief and sexual intimacy, he was like, oh, yeah, I bet people have loads of sex when they're grieving. Like, what a great way to deal with grief. It spans a real continuum. Do you find that in your work, that everybody is along that continuum somewhere?
Very much, yes. And firstly, I would like to say it's lovely to hear you describe your experience in that way, and that it was obviously very meaningful for you. And that's a very beautiful thing, because there are so many varied ways that we can experience death, depending on the relationship we've had with the person, how that death unfolds, and also what's going on in our own lives. So there are so many ways that we can experience this. And also, I think that probably influences then how we go on to move through that process. Because I think for some people, there's this kind of a going in and a need for quiet and not particularly reaching towards that intimacy. And then sometimes that's difficult, because I think there's a whole conversation around expectation of how quickly we should move through a process of grieving, which I'm fully certain we don't have time to get into. But the therapists that I spoke to, they often talked about people whose partners struggled with their partner's need to be with themselves, to be separate, and to not engage with them in a sexual way. And that caused problems, and it felt like a real perceived lack of understanding. And of course, there are many circumstances that then can unfold as a result of that, and that sense of not feeling seen, not feeling recognized by our partner, who's just deeply immersed in their own process. For other people, it was very much more that death represents the loss of connection. So what they're yearning for is connection, and that sense of needing to feel alive. And sex really is a way of doing that. It's a very visceral way to feel very present, very alive. Not always, of course. Again, when we're talking about dissociative experiences, there are so many permutations to this, which is why, for me, it was just so important to lift the lid on the subject, because there's so much actually that could be explored. And I think, like you said earlier on, some people, they reach for other experiences. They want intensity of some kind, and whether that's whether that's substances, whether that's risky behavior, whether that's more compulsive sexual behavior, or completely the opposite. There are so many different options and so many different ways that people experience bereavement.
Definitely. And then I guess there are those cases where the person you lose is your sexual partner. And so then that's really combining the mix together, that at the same time as losing a significant relationship, one's also lost access to the way that they reveal themselves and experienced euphoria or whatever was going on in that relationship. And of course, also perhaps we do lose partners when the relationship is not in a great place too, and maybe there have been problems there. So, there's really a lot in intimacy and death.
Absolutely. And it is rarely one loss. It changes many aspects of our lives. So again, when I spoke about it being a renegotiation, a lot of that is looking at more things which have shifted and changed and other potential losses that happen in the wake of this one significant death. How that unfolds is so incredibly individual.
Yeah. And that's something about the moksha houses, isn't it? That only the self can navigate those moksha houses. That's probably what makes them such a source of spiritual learning, but also they're only navigable by the person. There's no check seat or perfect template of what someone should do during that period. So one of the things that I wonder has an impact in this is rituals that perhaps in other times of humanity, or depending on what faith you might be in, there might still be rituals. But it strikes me that this is death and sex. It can have rituals associated with them. Is it something that you think can help people? And do we suffer from a loss of knowing what to do because we've lost some of those rituals?
I think so. And we keep a certain amount of ritual, and depending on our culture or our faith and all of those sorts of things, those rituals will look different, particularly around death. And I think there is an importance of ritual. There's an importance of a recognition, really, of what that does. It marks something important. The reason I think ritual is important is because it's going, no, this is a big thing. This is significant for me. And it's so significant that I feel the need to actually demonstrate that in some way. And for that reason, I think ritual's really powerful. The rituals that we have in place, perhaps culturally, don't always suit everybody. And not everybody wants to have the same kind of funerals or all of those kind of rituals. And I think perhaps there is a sense that we've lost the kind of community spaces where other kinds of rituals may have been possible, because we need witnesses. And that might sound strange, but sometimes our experiences are really brought real by somebody witnessing them. And that's a big part of the therapeutic process, but also in terms of ritual, that can be really important for that recognition, that acceptance, is to know that somebody at least else was there and they saw it happen. They saw us move through. And it can be ongoing. It doesn't have to be one ritual. It can then become annual ritual. There are theories with grieving that we have to move through all the anniversaries with other sort of traumatic episodes as well. I know anecdotally that sometimes, I know for myself, that sometimes it's like there's an echo that's experienced. And sometimes even when you're not thinking about the upcoming anniversary or something happening, like just something in your body knows that it's coming. Again, we're talking about super individual experiences, and what's meaningful for you in that might be really different. And sex is so complicated to talk about ritual because, again, there are so many options and so many ways that we could talk about this. Do we prepare a space? How do we move through that process? Do we have things that we need from our partners, from ourselves, in order to really feel connected and present, and to be able to be so vulnerable. Because of course, that's the other thing, is that sex is incredibly vulnerable. And when we're grieving, it's like we're walking around sometimes with this kind of wound that's open. And it's an incredibly vulnerable place to be. So to then add in this extra layer of vulnerability, sometimes we need to put into place, what do I need in order to be able to access this?
I totally agree with everything that you're saying there. So your takeaway in some ways is that to remind people the freedom that they have, the creativity to choose the rituals that work for them, even though in the past we might have had more structure, society or cultural wise, that we can choose our own rituals. It strikes me, I live in Portugal, so one of the rituals that people often observe at the death of a partner is wearing black for a period of time, or certainly women tend to wear black once they've lost their life partner. And it communicates to other people around them without the person saying anything at all that I'm perhaps in a time of introversion and maybe don't be offended if I'm not interacting with you.
I think different cultures have had different ways of expressing that. And I know in the past there's been black armbands and all of that kind of thing. And it's just a way of moving through the world going, you know what, could you please just be careful with me? Which is really important, because we don't have the same resilience. We don't necessarily have the same capacity to deal with things when we're going through such a big internal shift, particularly. And when we're figuring out the world around us again, it is, like I say, an incredibly vulnerable space. It's part of this rather, as I see it, unhelpful tendency to downplay what we're experiencing and to go back to work, go back to life very quickly. Sometimes we don't have a choice. Sometimes we absolutely don't have a choice. And we have to make that happen in the best way that we possibly can in the moment, of course. But to be able just ask for just a little bit of grace.
Yeah, I think it is really important. And I think different deaths are easier or to deal with, in that we just talked about death of the partner. Perhaps there's a ritual around that, at least where I live. And maybe death of the parents is something that in some way all children expect that they might have to navigate that. And maybe they're going to have siblings to help them with that. So we have some knowledge around that. But for women in their fertile period, there can be loss of child through miscarriage or through terminations. And that can often be like, pick yourself up and keep going. I think we are as a society now searching for ways to be more open about talking about the impact of that. But it's one of the ways that is often quite hidden. That loss may not be public to anybody outside the very intimate circle of the family. And yet we're still feeling all of those things, the vulnerability, like you were saying, a lowered resilience to any shocks or changes. And of course, the loss of a child is really difficult to deal with and hard to know how to integrate that.
And also, we may not want to share, we may not want to have to talk about what's happened. That's valid too, as you say. Sometimes it's a very limited circle of anyone who knows what you've gone through. But by the same token, we are still needing to exist within society, within the world. And I think it's so hard to do that in those moments. And I think one of the other things that came up within the research was around the death of a child. And there are other studies. Actually, one of my co-researchers has been very involved in studies of parents who've lost children, but also that each partner can react to that loss very differently. And that's also a really difficult thing, you know. And one partner may really want to try again, have another child, and they might want to do that quickly. The other partner doesn't. There are, again, so many different responses, so many different ways. It really fundamentally change a relationship too. And the need to mark and somehow just acknowledge the importance of what we've gone through I think is really valid. And perhaps it's not needed for everybody, and perhaps not everybody needs to make that an ongoing process. But when we do, if we can find ways to do that and to make space for that, it can be really helpful.
I was thinking about how astrology can be a helpful tool here. And then I also wanted to hear about how holistic methods are helpful as well. But to share some ideas around astrology. So if you're listening and you're interested in how astrology can support during this process, I think one of the things to notice for everybody is that these houses we've been talking about, the 4th, the 8th, and the 12th, will all be in the same element in your birth chart. So if your 4th house is in a fire sign, then the 8th house and the 12th house are in a fire sign. Or if they're in an air sign, they're all in air signs. So that's one thing to keep in mind, that they're using the same modality. So that might give some insight into how it's going to be experienced and what the challenges of that are, but what are the opportunities of that particular element that these houses are taking place in. Another way that astrology can help is a little bit what you were talking about. Sometimes we want to share and sometimes we don't want to share. So those, the 8th and the 12th, might be in masculine signs where we would think that taking an action is helpful. So it might be that we take up exercising, or we want to go on long walks, or want to do something during that time of renegotiating our identity. But there might be in feminine signs where we want time to integrate and we want to withdraw a little bit and be receptive to what this experience is about. It's unknown, and the only way for us to know what to do is to become quiet and to allow it to move through us. So the masculine and feminine nature of those houses could help. And then depending on what planets are associated with those houses, a solar house is going to have a very different response to a Saturnian house or a Martian house or a Venusian house. So knowing a little bit about the lord of that particular house, or if there's any planets in that house, or what's going on for the lord of that house. So these are the ways that astrology can help us negotiate these unknown transitions, is to give us some archetypes, to give us some myths as well that might help turn this unknown process into a discovery odyssey, something that we're working through the mystery with just a little guidance from Vedic astrology. And what about on the holistic side, Sarah? What are some of the things that you might work with clients or that you might suggest?
Firstly, it's so interesting. I have a billion questions that I would love to ask you about the explanation that you've just given. And there is a real importance to having places and spaces in which we feel safe enough to experience what we're going through, because also we can't be in our grieving 24/7. That kind of swallows us completely. And it's often about being able to be present with whatever aspect of our grieving we're in at the time, but then to be able to also do helpful, nourishing, positive things for ourselves, whatever that might be. And obviously those look different for different people, whether that's being with friends, whether that's having a massage, whether that's doing exercise, whether it's being in nature, whether it's just having quiet time to indulge ourselves in reading a book, making our favorite thing to eat. Everyone's going to have their own things that are really nourishing, comforting, and helpful in that way. And then our life, obviously, all the stuff of our life is still going on in between. And it's really important that we're making time both for our grieving process, but also for our restoration of ourselves. Because I don't think you used the word, but when you were talking, the thing that I was really thinking about is just the importance of hope. Because when we're going through these really difficult experiences, it can feel really hard to find that. But it's so important that we do find that, because we do come through the other side of these experiences. We can find ways to navigate them. And I'm not a fan of thinking that we put aside the experiences that we've had. It's more like we allow our lives to expand around them. We allow our lives to grow around the experiences that we've had, and to be able to find ways to expand again. And that can be how we process, how we understand our experiences. It can be in our physical experiences. There are so many different ways, again, that we can look at that. But finding places and finding ways to encourage ourselves to recognize that there is, if I dare use the word, hope and positivity, and that there is life waiting for us on the other side of this experience.
A beautiful strand to bring into our discussion, Sarah, and astrology can be so helpful with that as well. That gives us a way to see time expanding through our life and the various things that we've faced, and how we've grown through those experiences can help us know that we're going to get through this experience as well. And I think that's where astrology can hold our hands in this situation, revealing our strengths in these experiences already. And in some ways, that's where Vedic astrology and what yoga is trying to teach us is to help us practice this experience of fully enjoying the present moment and being fully present to the experience of that transition of the present moment into the next moment and into the next moment, just like the breathing in and the breathing out. So our yoga practice, our spiritual practices we have in our daily life and our mundane life, we have the chance to practice the skills that will give us the hope when these times come along. So I've always found it really inspiring to be on the spiritual path, because we have that opportunity to practice now all the time how to be good at letting things go, how to be good at fully receiving things, and how to be good at letting things go. And perhaps the mundane culture that we live in is a little bit more focused on the getting of things or the holding of on to things. We don't actively practice the letting go of things, but it's a really essential part of the whole cycle of life.
Yeah, and I think that spiritual dimension, whatever that means to a person, whether that's faith, whether that's science. I know for myself, whenever I want a reminder that there's just something so much bigger than me, I can walk out and look at the ocean and just feel that. And I find that incredibly powerful and meaningful to me. And again, as a meaning-making species, which humans are, we want ways to be able to integrate our experiences and find meaning, and whatever enables us to do that doesn't do harm is really powerful, because we need to be gentle with ourselves in these experiences. We need to hold the preciousness of our grief while we're also looking at what comes next, and the reminder that perhaps the environment around us doesn't change, or there are so many ways of finding that, or of having a practice, like you say, that you go back to again and again. I didn't come to yoga or meditation particularly as a result of bereavement, but I did find them sort of 25 years ago, just in a really difficult phase of life, and with no background in it at all, have found it to be something that I come back to again and again. And everybody needs to find their own way. And for me, I want them to be safe and to be able to have their experiences in that safety.
Sarah, this is a conversation I feel like we must pick up again. I hope you'll join me sometime again soon to delve even deeper into this topic.
I would love that.
Okay, but for today, I better wrap up and just thank you, Sarah, so much for bringing this really interesting, taboo topic into our Vedic Astrology podcast. There's been a lot of crossovers between the insights from Vedic Astrology and the insights from holistic therapy. And thank you also everyone for listening. And if you need to get in touch with Sarah,
people can get in touch with me via my website, which is therapylumina.com. That's probably the easiest way. They can also find me on Instagram, and I also write on Substack, so they could find me there too. And I think if I can leave one final thing on the table, is obviously that, yes, we can think of these subjects as taboo, but they will also touch all of us. We don't outrun that. These are topics that will touch all of our lives in some way and in some meaning. And we need to find ways to allow ourselves the permission to explore them in ways that are manageable and meaningful.
Great message. Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, everyone. See you next time on the Vedic Astrology podcast. Bye. The Vedic Astrology podcast is brought to you by a dedicated and intimate community of patrons. Perhaps you'd like to join us where we meet every week to check in and talk astrology, and where we have monthly gatherings to deep dive into our personal charts, to study Vedic astrology, and to apply and harness transits. Join us today, and thanks for listening to the Vedic Astrology podcast.